The heavy oak door to the penthouse didn't just close, it slammed with the finality of a gavel, vibrating through the Italian marble floors. Outside in the hallway, the frantic clicking of stiletto heels faded into a desperate run. "I'm sorry, Lorenzo. I value my life." The woman's voice had cracked, trailing off into a sob before the elevator chimed. Lorenzo Moretti stood in the center of his living room, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his jaw and the intricate geometric ink crawling up his neck. He looked like a masterpiece of modern power, athletic, draped in a custom tuxedo, and worth more than the city block he lived on. But as he stared at the 2 glasses of untouched crystal on the sideboard, he felt like a monster. He didn't move to stop her. He didn't even yell. He simply picked up a crystal decanter and shattered it against the floor. The explosion of glass was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the room. "Make it 8, he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl that masked a deep, hollow ache. 8 women in 3 months. 8 women who had been drawn to the charismatic king of Manhattan, lured by his intense gaze and the promise of a night with a man who looked like a god, only to flee in genuine terror once the clothes started to hit the floor. The gift that should have made him a legend among men had become a physical wall between him and the rest of the world. He was the boss of the Moretti family, he could order a hit with a nod, but he couldn't hold a woman for a single night without her fearing for her safety. His phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It was Dante, his consigliere. "Boss, the shipment at the Brooklyn pier is being held up by customs. They're asking for you personally." Lorenzo swiped the phone off the table and hurled it across the room. It dented the plaster before falling silent. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the family business. He didn't care about the millions of dollars or the territory disputes. He poured a finger of neat bourbon, downing it in one go, his mind spiraling back to how he'd ended up here. It had started 3 nights ago, in a moment of rare vulnerability. He'd been sitting in the dark of his private study when Dante had walked in, not with business papers, but with a look of genuine concern. "Lorenzo, you're becoming a ghost in your own house," Dante had said, leaning against the doorframe. "You need to get out. Not for a meeting. For yourself." "I've tried, Dante." "You know how it ends," Lorenzo had replied, his voice flat. "Then try something different. There's a girl, Lissa. She's not from our world. She doesn't care about the name Moretti, and she sure as hell isn't easily scared. She's a regular at the Velvet Room. Just go. Talk to her." Lorenzo had scoffed then, but the loneliness had eventually won. He had traded his tactical gear for a luxury watch and drove himself to the high-end lounge on the edge of the Diamond District. The Velvet Room was a haze of blue smoke and expensive perfume. He had bypassed the VIP section, opting for a dark corner where he could watch the room. That's when he saw her. Lissa Armando didn't walk into a room, she commanded the air within it. Dressed in a deep burgundy satin that looked like spilled wine against her skin, she moved with a quiet, honey-blonde grace that suggested she had seen things far more dangerous than a mafia boss. When their eyes met across the lounge, she didn't look away. She didn't blush or giggle. She gave him a slow, knowing smile, the kind of smile that promised she wasn't looking for a savior, but an equal. For the first time in years, Lorenzo felt a spark of hope that was even more terrifying than his loneliness. He didn't know then that she was a wolf in sheep's clothing, or that her presence in that room was no accident. He only knew that for once, he wanted to be the man she was looking at. "Hey family, before the story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless." The sun rose over the Manhattan skyline, bleeding orange and gold through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti penthouse, but to Lorenzo, the light felt like an intruder. He stood on his balcony, the cold morning air biting at his bare chest, tracing the geometric ink that wrapped around his throat. From this height, the people below looked like ants, and he was their king. He held the strings of the city's shipping, its high-end construction, and its most lucrative shadows. Yet, as he gripped the cold steel railing, he felt less like a king and more like a man serving a life sentence in a gilded cell. His daily routine was a choreographed display of absolute control. By 9 a.m., he was in the back of a blacked-out SUV, barking orders into a decrypted phone. By noon, he was sitting across from a terrified city councilman, leaning forward just enough to let the man see the coldness in his eyes. He was a master of intimidation, a titan of industry and blood. But every time his mind drifted, it went back to the previous night, the sound of that slamming door, the look of genuine physical fear on a woman's face, and the crushing realization that his own body was his greatest liability. The nightmare followed him even when he was awake. It was the recurring vision of being a giant among porcelain dolls, forever destined to break anything he dared to touch. He could buy anything in the world, but he couldn't buy a night of normalcy. When he returned to his office in the late afternoon, Dante was already there, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. The consigliere didn't speak immediately, he knew the moods of his boss better than anyone. He watched Lorenzo toss his blazer onto the leather sofa and rub his temples with a weariness that went bone deep. The councilman folded, Lorenzo muttered, dropping into his chair. "The docks are clear." "Good," Dante replied, sliding a glass across the desk. "But you look like a man who just lost a war, not won a contract." Lorenzo ignored the drink. "How many more, Dante? How many more times do I have to watch them run before I just accept that this is how it is? I'm 32 years old, and I'm living like a monk in a cathedral of sin." Dante sighed, his expression softening. He was one of the few people who knew the truth behind the Moretti legend, that the boss's fearsome reputation in the bedroom was actually a source of profound personal isolation. "I've been thinking about that," Dante said, pulling a small, unmarked card from his pocket. "The women you've been seeing, they're socialites, Lorenzo. They're used to pampered boys and soft lives. They don't have the constitution for a man like you. You need someone who isn't looking for a fairy tale. Someone who has walked through the fire herself." Lorenzo looked at the card. It had nothing but a time and a name, the Velvet Room. "I told you before, I'm done with the games," Lorenzo growled. "This isn't a game," Dante insisted. "I've done my homework. There's a woman there, Lissa Armando. She's different. She's an exclusive, but not in the way you think. She doesn't scare, Lorenzo. I've seen her handle the worst the city has to offer without breaking a sweat. If anyone can look at you and not see a monster, it's her." Lorenzo stared at the card, the weight of his golden cage pressing down on him. The silence in the office was heavy, filled with the unspoken reality of his loneliness. Finally, he reached out and took the card. "One more time, Dante," Lorenzo warned, his voice low. "But if she runs, I'm burning that club to the ground." The drive to the Velvet Room felt like a slow march toward another inevitable disappointment. Lorenzo gripped the steering wheel of his Bentley, his knuckles white against the leather. He had dressed with a clinical sort of precision, a black silk shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal the base of the geometric tattoo on his neck, and a tailored jacket that emphasized the broadness of his shoulders. He looked like the apex predator he was, but inside, he was braced for the moment the predator would be treated like a leper. The club was a sanctuary of hushed whispers and low-lit luxury. Dante had arranged everything, Lorenzo didn't have to stop at the bar or check in with the hostess. He was led through a private corridor to a suite tucked away from the thrumming bass of the main floor. When he reached the door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the gold handle. He considered turning back, returning to the cold safety of his penthouse, but the memory of Dante's words, "She doesn't scare," pushed him forward. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and something sweet, like jasmine. The lighting was dim, cast in hues of amber and deep violet. Then he saw her. Lissa Armando was not standing to greet him. She was reclined across the center of the massive velvet bed, propped up on one elbow. She wore a robe of deep burgundy satin that seemed to glow in the low light, the fabric clinging to her hourglass figure and falling open to reveal a long, shapely leg. Her honey blonde hair fell in soft, old Hollywood waves over her shoulder, framing a face that was strikingly beautiful, but it was her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. Most people looked at Lorenzo Moretti with either hunger or terror. Lissa looked at him with a calm, analytical intensity. She didn't flinch at his size or the dark energy he brought into the room. Instead, she took a slow sip from a crystal flute of champagne, her gaze never leaving his. "You're late, Lorenzo," she said, her voice a smooth, low-register honey that vibrated in his chest. "I was starting to think the rumors about your courage were exaggerated." Lorenzo closed the door behind him, the lock clicking into place. He walked toward the bed, his movements predatory yet cautious. He stopped a few feet away, looming over her, using his height to intimidate as he always did. It was a defense mechanism, a way to see if she would blink. She didn't. She didn't even sit up. She simply tilted her head, watching him with a faint, knowing smile that made his blood run hot. "You know who I am?" he asked, his voice a gravelly warning. "I know you're a man who spends a lot of time being feared," she replied, setting her glass down on the nightstand and finally sitting up. The robe shifted, revealing the soft curve of her cleavage and the steady, rhythmic pulse at the base of her throat. She wasn't trembling. "But you're in a room where that power doesn't mean much. Here, you're just a guest. And I'm your host." She stood up then, moving with a grace that reminded him of a cat, unhurried and dangerous. She stepped into his personal space, so close he could smell the champagne on her breath and the warmth of her skin. She reached out, her fingers grazing the ink on his neck. Her touch wasn't tentative, it was firm and sure. "You're tense," she whispered, looking up at him through thick lashes. "Are you afraid I'll run, Lorenzo? Or are you afraid I'll stay?" The silence in the room was usually the precursor to the end, the heavy, suffocating moment when a woman's eyes would widen, her breath would hitch in a panicked sob, and she would begin the frantic scramble for her clothes. Lorenzo stood by the edge of the bed, his muscles corded like iron, his heart hammering a rhythmic warning against his ribs. He had bared himself to her, braced for the rejection that had become his only constant. He waited for the gasp. He waited for the fear. Instead, he felt a cool, steady hand settle against his chest. Lissa didn't pull away. She didn't recoil. She moved closer, her honey blonde waves brushing against his skin as she leaned in to inspect him with a clinical, almost reverent focus. When she looked up, her doe eyes weren't filled with terror, they were filled with a calm, practical understanding that left him speechless. "I spent 3 years as a combat medic before I ever set foot in a place like this, Lorenzo," she whispered, her voice steady and devoid of the usual high-pitched panic. "I've seen what the human body can endure, how it's built, and how it breaks. You think you're a monster because you're built on a different scale, but I see a man who has been carrying shame for a gift." She reached out, her thumb tracing a jagged, silver scar on his hip, a remnant of a bullet wound he'd received years ago. Then, she took his hand and guided it to the side of her own waist, pulling the burgundy silk back just enough to reveal a faint, puckered line of white scar tissue running along her ribs. "We all have things that make us too much for the world to handle," she said, her gaze locking onto his, intense and unyielding. "I've survived things that would have ended a lesser woman. I'm not made of glass, Lorenzo. You aren't going to break me." For the first time in his adult life, the tension that had lived in Lorenzo's shoulders began to dissolve. The golden cage of his insecurity cracked open. He watched as she moved with a nurse-like pragmatism, showing him with soft touches and whispered instructions that there was a way to navigate the intensity of their connection. She treated his body not as a threat, but as a map she was perfectly capable of reading. As the night deepened, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't the feared Mafia boss, and she wasn't the mysterious lady from the club. They were simply two people who had found the one person in a city of millions who wasn't intimidated by their extremes. When he finally lowered himself beside her, expecting her to flinch, she reached out and pulled him closer, her body molding to his with a confidence that felt like a benediction. For the first time, the door didn't slam. For the first time, the penthouse didn't feel like a tomb. As Lissa fell asleep with her head against his chest, her breath steady and unafraid, Lorenzo stared at the ceiling, feeling a strange, terrifying sensation. He felt human. He was no longer the freak or the beast. He was just a man, and for the first time in his life, someone had chosen to stay. The piece Lorenzo felt was a fragile thing, a glass ornament held in a trembling hand. For hours, he lay in the soft glow of the city lights, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Lissa's shoulders. The silence of the penthouse was no longer haunting, it was a sanctuary. He felt a protective warmth radiating from his chest, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. He wanted to freeze this moment, to live in a world where he was simply a man lying next to a woman who truly saw him. Thirst eventually pulled him from the bed. He moved with the predatory silence of a cat, careful not to disturb the honey blonde hair fanned across his pillows. As he reached for his silk robe, his foot brushed against Lissa's burgundy wrap, which had fallen to the floor in the heat of the night. He bent to retrieve it, intending to drape it neatly over a chair, but as he lifted the heavy satin, he felt an unnatural weight in the hem. His instincts, honed by years of surviving the treacherous currents of the Moretti Empire, screamed. He ran his thumb along the seam. There, nestled into the luxury fabric, was a hard, circular lump no larger than a button. Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. He took a small pocketknife from his nightstand and sliced through the silk with surgical precision. A tiny, sophisticated tracking device fell into his palm, its microscopic LED light blinking a steady, mocking red. It wasn't standard police issue, it was high-end syndicate tech, the kind used by deep-cover operatives to transmit audio and location data in real time. The betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow, sharper and more agonizing than any bullet he had ever taken. He looked back at the bed, at the woman who had just broken the curse of his isolation. He had bared his greatest shame to her, and she had met it with a healer's touch that he now realized might have been a calculated play. Every soft word, every lingering touch, every moment of acceptance was suddenly tainted by the possibility that it was all a performance designed to get her close enough to plant a bug in the heart of his empire. The physical rejections of the past had left him feeling like a monster, but this was worse. This made him feel like a fool. He stood in the center of the room, the tiny device vibrating slightly in his hand as if it were laughing at him. He thought of the combat medic stories, the scars she had shown him, were they even real, or were they part of a carefully crafted backstory designed to lower his guard? The vulnerability he had felt only an hour ago vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar rage. He didn't wake her with a shout. Instead, he sat in the armchair across from the bed, the shadows of the room swallowing him whole. He watched her sleep, his gaze now stripped of warmth and filled with the icy calculation of a mafia boss. He realized that the tracker was likely broadcasting at this very second. Someone was listening. Someone was watching. And the woman he had finally trusted was the one holding the door open for his enemies. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Lissa stirred, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she reached out for the empty space beside her. Lorenzo didn't move. He sat in the dark, the tracking device held between his fingers, waiting for her eyes to open so he could see the lie die in them. Lissa's eyes fluttered open, her hand sweeping across the silk sheets in search of the warmth that had been there only an hour before. When she found only cold fabric, she sat up, her honey blonde waves falling over her shoulders. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, cutting through the room to reveal Lorenzo. He wasn't in bed. He was sitting in the high-backed velvet chair 5 feet away, his tuxedo trousers on but his chest bare, his silhouette as motionless as a gargantua carved from stone. The air in the room had changed. The tenderness of the night had been replaced by a static charge that made the hair on her arms stand up. Then she saw it, his 9mm Beretta resting on his thigh, and in his other hand, the mangled remains of her burgundy robe. The hem was a little heavy, Lissa, Lorenzo said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. He tossed the tiny, blinking tracker onto the bed. It bounced softly, landing inches from her hip. Lissa froze, the color draining from her face. She didn't scream, and she didn't try to run. She looked at the device, then up at the cold, dead eyes of the man who had looked at her with such raw hope only hours ago. "Lorenzo," she started, her voice trembling. "Don't," he snapped, the barrel of the gun rising in a slow, deliberate arc until it leveled at her chest. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who want me dead, but I've never let one sleep in my bed." Was it all a script? The medic stories? The way you looked at me like I wasn't a freak? Was that just the professional touch of a syndicate rat? Lissa took a shaky breath, her hands flat against the mattress. "I was sent by Silas Vane," she whispered, the honesty cutting through the room like a blade. "He's obsessed with your territory. He knew about the women fleeing this penthouse. He thought your complication was a psychological weakness he could exploit. He sent me to find the crack in the armor." Lorenzo's finger tightened on the trigger. The betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the air out of his lungs. "And did you find it?" "I found a man, Lorenzo. Not a target." Lissa leaned forward, despite the weapon pointed at her heart. "Check the transmission logs on that device." "Go ahead. Call your tech team. That tracker hasn't sent a burst signal in 48 hours. I disabled the outgoing feed the second night I met you." Lorenzo's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping in his cheek. "Why? To play a longer game?" "Because I realized I couldn't do it," she cried, tears finally blurring her doe eyes. "I was supposed to find your pressure points, to give Vane a reason to strike. But then I saw the way you look at yourself in the mirror when you think no one is watching. I felt the way you held me like I was the first person who ever treated you like a human being. I fell for the man behind the monster, Lorenzo. And now, because I stopped reporting, Silas knows I've turned. He doesn't just want you anymore. He wants me dead too." Lorenzo stared at her, the gun steady in his hand, his mind a battlefield of instinct and desire. He wanted to believe her, but in his world, belief was a death sentence. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, as he searched her face for the flicker of a lie. All he saw was the same fearless, calm intensity that had drawn him to her at the club, only now, it was mixed with a devastating grief. The tension in the room remained high, but the barrel of the Beretta lowered an inch as Lorenzo searched Lissa's eyes for the deceit he was so sure must be there. He was a man who lived by the blade and the bullet. He didn't understand mercy, only leverage. A combat medic? Lorenzo repeated, the words sounding foreign in the context of the luxury penthouse. Vane doesn't hire healers. He hires ghosts and butchers. Lissa sat up straighter, the burgundy satin sliding further down her shoulder, but she didn't bother to pull it back. She looked at him with a weary, ancient clarity. I wasn't hired, Lorenzo. I was owned. 3 years ago, I was operating on soldiers in Kandahar. I saw human bodies torn apart by shrapnel and rebuilt by sheer will. I came home to a brother who had gambled away money he didn't have to Silas Vane's bookies. When they came to collect, they didn't want his life. They wanted my hands. My skills. She looked down at her palms, her fingers long and steady. Vane uses me to patch up his soldiers off the grid. He keeps my brother in a gilded cage in Jersey as collateral. When he heard about your reputation, he saw a way to use me for intelligence instead of surgery. He thought my medical background would make me the only woman capable of getting close enough to you to plant that wire without flinching. Lorenzo felt a slow, cold realization wash over him. His curse, the very thing that had kept him isolated and ashamed, had been weaponized by a rival. So the calm at the club, the way you looked at me in the dark, it was all just professional detachment? No, Lissa snapped, her voice cracking with a sudden, raw intensity. In the beginning, maybe. I told myself you were just another patient, another body to manage. But a medic sees the truth of a person when they're at their most vulnerable. Most men in your position are monsters all the way down. But you were just a man who had been told he was a freak so many times he started to believe it. She stood up, ignoring the weapon entirely, and walked toward him until her knees brushed against his. She reached out, her fingers warm and certain as they traced the geometric ink on his neck, moving down to the heavy muscle of his shoulder. I'm not afraid of your size, Lorenzo, because I've seen the limits of what a body can take, and you are nowhere near those limits. I've seen men survive explosions. I'm not going to be broken by a man who is built for a different kind of intensity. Vane sent me because he thought I would be the only one who could handle you. He was right. But he was wrong to think I'd hand you over to him. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. He's going to come for us now. He knows the feed is dead. He knows I've chosen a side. Lorenzo finally let the gun rest on the velvet upholstery of the chair. He reached up, his massive hand cupping the side of her face with a gentleness that felt like a quiet revolution. For the first time, the golden cage didn't just feel open, it felt like it was being dismantled. Then let him come, Lorenzo growled, his voice thick with a new kind of purpose. He wanted to find my weakness. He's about to find out that I just found my strength. The stillness of the morning was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, eerie loss of the city's distant hum. Lorenzo felt it first, the way the air in the penthouse seemed to thicken with a premonition of violence. He pulled Lissa back from the window just as the high-pitched whistle of a suppressed round sliced through the glass. A spiderweb of fractures bloomed across the reinforced pane, centered exactly where Lissa's head had been a second before. Down! Lorenzo roared, his voice stripping away the last remnants of the vulnerable man and replacing him with the cold, tactical mind of the Moretti kingpin. He didn't need to check the security monitors to know what was happening. Silas Vane wasn't a man of subtle messages. If the honey trap failed, the only alternative was total erasure. Outside, the screech of tires echoed from the street below as 2 blacked-out SUVs breached the estate's perimeter, ignoring the security gates. The bedroom closet, Lorenzo commanded, dragging Lissa toward the heavy oak doors of his walk-in wardrobe. He kicked a hidden floor plate, and a section of the shelving slid back to reveal a rack of tactical gear and high-caliber weaponry. "Put this on. Now." He handed her a lightweight Kevlar vest. Lissa didn't hesitate. The healer moved with the grim efficiency of someone who had lived through Kandahar, cinching the straps with steady hands while Lorenzo checked the chamber of his custom AR-15. "Silas doesn't just send hitmen," Lissa whispered, her eyes wide but sharp. "He sends fire teams. He won't stop until this entire floor is a tomb." "He picked the wrong day to try," Lorenzo growled. He pulled a radio from the rack. "Dante, report." Static hissed, then his consigliera's voice broke through, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of distant gunfire. "They're in the lobby, boss. Vane's mercenaries. They've cut the elevators, but they're coming up the service stairs. We're holding them at the 20th floor, but they brought heavy hardware." "Get the men to the secondary fallback point," Lorenzo ordered. "I'm taking Lissa through the roof access. We're going to the docks. If Vane wants a war, I'll give him one on the water where his numbers don't mean a damn thing." A heavy thud echoed from the penthouse's main entrance, the sound of a breaching charge hitting the reinforced steel. Lorenzo grabbed Lissa's hand, his grip crushing but grounding. He looked at her, seeing the way her burgundy robe was now partially covered by tactical black, her honey blonde hair pulled back into a tight, practical knot. She looked like a soldier, and for the first time, Lorenzo didn't feel like he had to protect a porcelain doll. He had a partner. "Stay behind me, stay low, and do not stop running until we hit the stairs," he told her. The front door exploded inward in a hail of splinters and smoke. Through the haze, the red laser dots of tactical sights began to dance across the expensive Italian furniture. Lorenzo stepped into the hallway, his weapon raised, the geometric tattoo on his neck pulsing with the rush of adrenaline. He was no longer the man who was too much for the world, he was exactly what was needed to survive it. As the first mercenary rounded the corner, Lorenzo pulled the trigger, the muzzle flash lighting up the room as the Moretti penthouse turned into a slaughterhouse. The elevators were death traps, so they took the service stairs, moving downward in a blur of suppressed gunfire and shouting. Lorenzo led the way, his massive frame acting as a shield for Lissa. Every time a door burst open, he neutralized the threat with terrifying, practiced efficiency. They reached the sub-basement garage just as a black SUV roared toward the exit. Lorenzo didn't hesitate, he shoved Lissa into his custom-armored Charger, the engine screaming to life with a predatory growl that drowned out the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. "Hold on," Lorenzo commanded, slamming the car into gear. The garage exit was blocked by two of Vane's vehicles. Lorenzo didn't touch the brakes. He aimed for the gap, the reinforced chrome bumper of the Charger shredding the side of the lead SUV with a violent shriek of metal. They burst onto the midnight streets of Manhattan, a high-speed ballet of blood and chrome. 3 cars were on their tail, weaving through late-night traffic with reckless abandon. "Lorenzo, the left!" Lissa cried, leaning out the window to return fire with a handgun she'd snatched from the armory. A bullet shattered the side mirror, and a jagged shard of glass caught Lissa across the shoulder. She hissed in pain, slumped back into the seat, her hand immediately flying to the wound. Lorenzo's heart skipped, not from fear for himself, but for the woman who had finally made him feel whole. The rage that followed was cold and absolute. "Stay down," he growled, his voice dropping into a register that promised extinction. He swung the wheel, taking a sharp turn toward the industrial docks of the west side. The tires screamed against the asphalt. As they neared the darkened piers, Lorenzo saw the trap, more of Vane's men were waiting. He didn't slow down. He drove the Charger straight toward a stack of shipping containers, pulling the e-brake at the last possible second to drift the heavy car into a defensive position. Before the car had even stopped vibrating, Lorenzo was out. He pulled Lissa from the passenger side, scooping her up in one arm while his other hand kept the AR-15 leveled at the approaching shadows. Her blood was warm against his chest, staining his black silk shirt. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. A mercenary lunged from behind a crate, but Lorenzo didn't even need the gun. He used his sheer physical mass, stepping into the man's space and delivering a blow that sounded like a tree limb snapping. He moved with a tactical fluidity that defied his size, using the environment to create a bottleneck. Every time Vane's men tried to flank them, Lorenzo was there, a wall of muscle and fire that refused to break. He reached the edge of the pier where his private speedboat was docked. He lowered Lissa gently onto the deck, his eyes scanning the horizon for the next wave. He was covered in sweat and the copper tang of blood, but as he looked down at Lissa, who was already using her medic training to apply pressure to her own wound, he felt a fierce, primal pride. "They're coming for the boat," she gasped, pointing to the headlights approaching the pier. "Let them," Lorenzo said, his gaze locking onto the lead vehicle. "They think they're hunting a man. They're about to find out they're hunting a ghost." The twin engines of the cigarette boat roared to life, a guttural scream that echoed off the concrete pillars of the pier. Lorenzo didn't look back as the dock erupted in a final, desperate volley of gunfire. He pushed the throttles forward, and the bow lifted, slicing through the black glass of the East River. Beside him, Lissa sat braced against the passenger seat, her face pale but her eyes fixed on him with a steady, unwavering trust. They didn't head for the open sea. Not yet. Lorenzo steered the craft toward a secluded inlet under the shadow of the Queensboro Bridge, where a nondescript sedan sat waiting. In the trunk of that car lay the Moretti ledger, a digital ghost of every bribe, every shipment, and every sin committed by the families of New York for the last decade. It was the only shield strong enough to protect them, and the only weapon sharp enough to cut Silas Vane out of existence. Lorenzo stopped the boat and turned to Lissa. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an encrypted drive. "This is the Empire," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "Everything I've built. Everything I am. If I hand this over, there is no Moretti family. There is no King of Manhattan. I become a ghost, Lissa. We both do." Lissa reached out, her fingers stained with the copper of her own blood, and covered his hand. "The king was a lonely man, Lorenzo. I'd rather have the ghost." With a final, decisive nod, Lorenzo triggered the remote detonator he'd left in the penthouse. Far across the city, the top floor of the Moretti Tower blossomed into a spectacular orange flower of flame. The records, the history, and the physical memory of his reign turned to ash in seconds. He then dialed a number he had memorized years ago, a direct line to a federal prosecutor who had been trying to bury Vane for a decade. "Check the drop box at the 42nd Street locker," Lorenzo said when the man answered. "You'll have Silas Vane on a silver platter by morning. In exchange, the Moretti name dies tonight. Don't look for us." He crushed the phone under his heel and tossed the pieces into the dark water. The city skyline, once his checklist of conquests, now looked like nothing more than a distant, flickering constellation. He helped Lissa into the sedan, his massive hand lingering on her waist, feeling the warmth of her body and the steady beat of her heart. The gift that had made him a freak to the world, the power that had made him a target, and the name that had made him a god, he left it all on the riverbank. He climbed into the driver's seat and looked at Lissa. She was leaning back, her honey blonde hair messy and her shoulder bandaged, but she was smiling. It was the smile of a woman who had seen the monster and found the man. Lorenzo put the car in gear and drove away from the fire and the blood, heading toward the quiet, nameless horizon. For the first time in 32 years, the air didn't feel heavy. The cage was gone. He was no longer a boss, a freak, or a legend. He was just Lorenzo, and for the first time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The story of the Mafia boss was over, the life of the man had finally begun. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.